Hello again, Dan Alasso with History for Today. And today I would like to mention Albert Memmi, who lived from 1920 to 2020, who was a Tunisian writer who was first known for his fiction and later for his anti-colonial nonfiction. And I assigned a reading from his book to my students in my Decolonization class today, and we discussed it and had a very good discussion. Memmi was a Tunisian writer, as I said, who wrote in French and is often mentioned in the same sentence as Frantz Fanon, who also wrote about decolonization in the same period in the 1940s and 50s. Memmi was apparently one of the children of colonialism who rejected that system. He was educated in Tunis at the elite schools, and his education culminated at the Sorbonne, where he studied philosophy. During the Nazi occupation of North Africa, he was sent to a labor camp with other Jewish prisoners, and he escaped. Because he rubbed elbows with a lot of famous French philosophers, his first novel, The Pillar of Salt, published in 1953, had a preface by Albert Camus. His best-known nonfiction book, The Colonizer and the Colonized, which I had my students read a passage from today, published in 1957, had a preface by Jean-Paul Sartre. So in The Colonizer and the Colonized, Memmi distinguished between two groups of colonizers, those who agreed to be colonizers and those, presumably like himself, who reject the colonial concept altogether. Those who agree, he said, then make it their mission to legitimize colonization. The logic is, should they not be convinced of the excellence of the system, which makes them what they are? Henceforth, they will defend it, he says, aggressively. They will end up believing it to be right. In other words, the acceptor of the colonizing project and the immigrant has been transformed into a colonialist. Now, this doesn't happen to all of the children in the colonial regime. The best young people in colonial societies, he says, go away, rejecting the inequity that they are born into. Those who choose to remain and those who move to the colonies are, in Memmi's words, only men of small stature and mediocrities. The problem of colonial administrations, Memmi said, is that promotion of mediocre personnel is not a temporary error, but a lasting catastrophe from which the colony never recovers. And he also says, it is the mediocre citizens who set the general tone of the colony. Worse than the inept levels of colonial administration that result, because, Memmi says, better management of the colony hardly forms part of the purposes of colonization. But worse than that is the psychological effect on those who, in Memmi's words, have wagered everything and for keeps on the colony. These mediocre colonizers know that they are living far better than they really have a right to, based on their contribution to society. They are more successful in business and they raise higher in society, merely because they are part of the elite ruling class of the colony. Back at home in the mother country, they would not have risen as high, and they would not be enjoying the luxury of power over people that they can exercise in the colony. Memmi says, accepting the reality of being a colonizer means agreeing to be a non-legitimate privileged person. Memmi calls this usurpation, and he asks, how can usurpation try to pass for legitimacy? One attempt can be made by demonstrating the usurper's eminent merits, so eminent that they deserve such compensation. And along with this, of course, goes denigrating the colonized. A good example of this was the young Cecil Rhodes' Confession of Faith, which he wrote during his single year at Oxford after his first short experience of being a colonizer and buying into the idea of colonialism, before he went back to embrace that life fully. Rhodes declared, I contend that we are the finest race in the world, and that the more of the world that we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. Just fancy those parts that are at present inhabited by the most despicable specimens of human beings. What an alteration there would be if they were brought under Anglo-Saxon influence. A psychologically very revealing moment, I think, and a horrible piece of writing. Almost all of that was one entire run-on sentence. But I think this well illustrates the problem that Memmi is describing. The eulogizing of oneself, he says, and one's fellows, and the repeated, even earnest affirmation of the excellence of one's ways and institutions, one's cultural and technical superiority, do not erase the fundamental condemnation which every colonialist carries in his heart. In order for his position of privilege to exist, he cannot help but approve discrimination and the codification of injustice. And he basks in the privileges of his chosen life. Easy living, numerous servants, abundant pleasures, impossible in Europe, anachronistic authority, even the low cost of gasoline, Memmi says. But at the same time, the colonist knows that in his own country, he would be nothing. He would go back to being a mediocre man. Memmi also describes how, in order for these privileges to continue, colonialism itself must continue. This forces the colonialist to support the most conservative political party in his home country, because it is the one that will maintain the status quo. And actually, there is a seed of fascism in this. There's a danger even for the home country, because the colony presents what Memmi calls an alluring example of a political pattern whose difficulties are resolved by the complete servitude of the governed. And wouldn't it just be every authoritarian's dream not to have to worry about people who disagree with you? The colonialist, Memmi says, must unceasingly see to it, intervening if necessary, that his home country continue to maintain the troops that protect him, maintain the political habits that tolerate him, and keep up the appearance that suits him. I wonder if in today's world, multinational corporations that operate in foreign countries aren't, in a way, the new colonialists. Don't they look to the U.S. for exactly these protections, while taking advantage of the lower wage rates and the laxer regulations of these colonies overseas? And don't they kind of have the same weird relationship with the home country, where they tout its cultural superiority to encourage consumerism, while at the same time avoiding its taxes? And also, in spite of the stories that they tell themselves and the world about civilizing the savages and about the white man's burden, the colonizer has no actual intention of ever improving the lives of the colonized. His own position depends on the subjugation of the colonized. The true reason, the principal reason for most deficiencies, Memmi says, is that the colonialist never planned to transform the colony into the image of his homeland, nor to remake the colonized in his own image. He cannot allow such an equation. It would destroy the principle of his privileges. Finally, Memmi says, the colonizer really has no way to resolve the cognitive dissonance. In a last-ditch attempt, he becomes a racist. The only way to deny the possibility of equality is to say that the colonized are not only unworthy, but that they're actually incapable of being equal to him. Memmi says, colonial racism is built on three major ideological components. One, the gulf between the culture of the colonialist and the colonized. Two, the exploitation of these differences for the benefit of the colonialist. And three, the use of these supposed differences as standards of absolute fact. Maybe we ought to ask, does this type of racism operate within countries as well as between an imperialist and its colonial possessions? In what ways might we describe the U.S. approach to black people throughout its history as colonialism? More generally, do we hear any echoes of this type of thought in the ways that maybe coastal elites regard people in the flyover regions of red state America? Memmi says, all the efforts of the colonialist are directed toward maintaining this social immobility. And I'm reminded of today's voter suppression efforts, which are mostly directed at the black and the brown right now, but may soon include those who just can't be counted on as votes for the military-industrial or the petro-industrial or the prison-industrial or the pharma-industrial complexes. Memmi says that one of the most common complaints of the colonizer criticizing the colonized is that they're lazy. Is it any wonder that the ruled are quote-unquote ungrateful and aren't eager to follow the orders of the rulers? James C. Scott at Yale University wrote a lot of books on this topic, and the one that deals most directly with it is called Weapons of the Weak. But Memmi also says that after generations, some of this characterization becomes internalized, and the colonized can begin to think of themselves as less than, as being kind of what they're told in the culture that they are. Which just makes me think it must have been a very difficult process, and the people who did it must have been very careful to try to rebuild a sense of worth and also of moral outrage at the way they had been treated as colonized people, while at the same time trying to channel that outrage into a nonviolent response to colonialism. So to the degree that people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King succeeded with that, it is a real achievement. So I thought people would find this look at Albert Memmi and his writing about the colonizers and the colonized interesting. I think it does have some resonance with today. I hope people found it a little bit interesting. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again